become somewhat of a perennial issue, or even a constant issue. And that is this idea that the federal government doesn't give enough federal revenue to the provincial government, and that as a result, the provincial government can't balance its books. So let's follow this again. I can't balance my books because you didn't give me enough money. That's the story we're being told by the McGuinty government. And with the full support of the provincial Conservatives and the NDP, who agree with that mantra, that the reason we're in trouble is because the federal government hasn't given the province enough money. Well, look, first of all, the Constitution of Canada is pretty clear that the federal government raises money for federal purposes and the provincial government raises money for provincial purposes. The federal government does not impose federal taxes so that it can be spent on provincial responsibilities. It's not supposed to do that. Now, I'm not saying it hasn't been done. It's been done that way for decades, despite the fact that the Constitution doesn't really provide for it. And the excuse has been, by those who are apologizing for the practice, that, well, you know, what taxes you can impose, that's one issue, and that is determined by the Constitution. But once you have your money, you can spend it on anything you want. Now, Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1957 criticized that position. I mean, this is a practice that goes back, mind you, goes back to, you know, the Second World War. And what happened at that time was that you know, the federal governments had these grand plans for a planned economy. This was a new way of doing things, where the government would become very active in the economy. The idea was that the federal government would try to offset downtimes when the business wasn't so strong in Canada by spending more of your money on federal ideas, like building railroads or roads or just about anything. Buildings of any sort, any kind of infrastructure, giving people jobs to do various services that probably didn't really need to be done by the government. All of that would be a way to keep people at work when there wasn't really any demand, wasn't sufficient demand in the private sector for private sector services. So that was the idea. Now, there's a problem. The Constitution of Canada divides the power to impose taxes and the power of spending, really, between the federal governments and the provincial governments. So the federal government is allowed to impose any tax that the provinces can't impose. Let's do that again. So the provinces have certain taxes they can impose, and the federal government is not allowed to impose those taxes. Now, generally speaking, the dividing line is this, that the province can impose direct taxes, which means taxes on you, taxes on your income, etc., taxes on your anything you leave when you pass away. They can impose taxes on those things, and they can then spend that money only on provincial purposes. And what are provincial purposes? Well, provincial purposes are things that only the province has jurisdiction over. So, for example, in our Constitution, only the province has the power to make laws concerning healthcare, concerning education, concerning, well, there's a wide variety of things. And under our Constitution, the federal government has exclusive power over other things. Like, for example, only the federal parliament can pass criminal laws. Only the federal parliament can pass laws concerning railroads or, you know, the telephone system. And so the federal government is supposed to impose taxes that the provinces can't impose, and only those taxes that the provinces can't impose. And then it can spend that money on those federal purposes like criminal law and etc., railroads and whatnot. Now, the practice has been, though, since World War II, well, look, we're going to collect more than enough money at the federal level to cover our federal responsibilities. And then we're going to have this pot of extra money. And we're going to say to the provinces, hey, would you like some? You can have it, but if you want to have this money, you have to do certain things with your jurisdiction, with your laws. We can't pass laws at the federal level over things like healthcare and education or welfare, but you can at the provincial level. And as long as you make those provincial healthcare systems and education systems and welfare systems consistent with federal designs and federal specifications, well, we'll give you federal money. So the idea is that the federal government can't pass provincial laws. They can't pass laws about education, healthcare, welfare, that kind of thing. But they can hold on to a bunch of money, and they can say, look, if you want your money, if you want your share of the pie, you have to pass your laws according to the way we want them. That's called the federal spending power, and that would be called a conditional grant, where they say you get the grant, but only if you play ball. And this was a way, of course, where the federal government got to control everything that goes on. Not just federal things, not just federal laws, not just federal programs, but also got to get its hands into things like provincial healthcare, provincial education, welfare, and all that kind of thing. And that was necessary according to the ideology of the centrally planned economy. A centrally planned economy is one in which the government, as I say, intervenes greatly in the economy. And as I said, the federal government was trying to make sure that there weren't as many, or at least that the ups and downs of the business cycle weren't as deep. Perhaps that they could neutralize them all together, but that was a pipe dream. Now, it is the case that this went on for decades. In fact, it's still going on today. The federal government, through things like the Canada Health Act, through various other bits of legislation, offers federal revenue to provinces who play ball with their healthcare, education, and welfare systems. If they don't play ball, the threat is that they won't get some of that money. And so whenever you hear Canada Health Act, what that really means is not that the federal government has any power to make laws concerning healthcare. They don't. What they have the power to do is make laws concerning who gets a chunk of the federal pie and under what conditions they'll get a chunk of the federal pie for healthcare. And so the Canada Health Act sets out certain things that have to be satisfied by the provincial healthcare system, like it has to be available to everybody on the same terms. It can't turn anybody away, that kind of thing. And as long as the provincial health plan complies with those specifications, then the province will get a share of the excess federal revenues that were collected by the federal government. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why would any province ever want to get into this kind of deal with the devil, as it were? Well, provincial politicians are just like any other politician. If they can get money without imposing taxes, that's great, because then they don't get any backlash for imposing a tax. So imagine that you're a politician in Ontario, and some politician from Ottawa, some Ottawa politician says, hey, we're willing to take the flack of raising taxes, and we'll give you some of that extra tax that we collect, but you just have to make sure that you follow federal specifications when making healthcare laws and when making education laws and etc. Now, you might be under a bit of pressure because you haven't been balancing your books quite well, and this is an opportunity to solve all your problems by getting a cash infusion from the federal government. And all you have to do is, well, play ball a bit. Make your laws according to federal specifications. Very attractive. You're going to get all this money, and no Ontario voter is going to vote against you for having raised taxes because you didn't raise taxes. All you did was you got a bunch of money from the federal government. The federal politicians, those are the ones who are going to take the flack, if anybody does. And so what happened when these deals were offered was that all the provinces jumped right in. They said, great, free money. All I have to do is tie one hand behind my back and obey you, federal government. The federal government in the late 1960s offered to help out with the costs of healthcare. Under this plan, the hope was that every province would basically ban private health insurance from being sold or bought in the province, set up a government monopoly on health insurance, and pay for that health insurance, pay the premiums by collecting tax money from you. It didn't have to be done that way, but that's the way it was expected it would probably be done. And that's exactly what did happen in Ontario. Effective October 1, 1969, private healthcare was banned in the province of Ontario. That was done by the Progressive Conservative government of John Robarts. Of course, the federal government wasn't offering to pay for all of the healthcare. The province would have to kick in some money too. And so the provincial government imposed a new tax, the income tax, the provincial income tax, and that was to pay for the health premiums, the other part of the health premiums that would go into this government-run, government monopoly on health insurance, which we all now fondly know as OHIP. Ontario Hospital Insurance Plan was the name at the time. Now, the OHIP grew in scope. It included more and more things over the years, became more and more expensive. In fact, it has rarely, if ever, managed to stop growing. Approximately 59% of all of the taxes you pay in Ontario, 59%, not just the ones you pay, but in fact, 59% of all of the taxes paid by anybody in Ontario. So all of the tax revenue, put it in a big pot, 59% of it is spent on healthcare. Only on healthcare, not on education, not on roads, not on police, nothing. It gets spent only on healthcare. 59% of the taxes paid in Ontario. The population's aging, and as you get older, your need for healthcare services increases, especially in the last 2 weeks of your life, when most of the money ever spent on your health will be spent. Now, because this baby boom generation is retiring, and because demands for healthcare are increasing, and because there isn't the same amount of population behind them to take their jobs and keep providing tax revenues to the government to pay for healthcare, we're finding that there's less money coming in per person that wants to use the healthcare system. That's a combination of factors. It's more demand on the healthcare system and perhaps fewer people paying the taxes. At the same time, we're suffering a loss of industrial capacity that's moving off to places like China because the price of labor in Ontario and the price of electricity in Ontario is just too high. There are too many people manufacturing things in China, too many competitors manufacturing things in China, not to be manufacturing your own goods in China. So a great number of even the parts that are in your North American vehicles are being made in Asia, are being made outside of North America. For the last year and a half, 2 years, McGuinty has been doing the exact same thing as many premiers before him have done. That is, to blame his inability to balance the budget on insufficient money coming in from the federal level, from the federal tax revenues. He's saying the federal government is not giving enough federal tax revenue to the province of Ontario, not kicking enough money into the provincial pot. And Don McGuinty has an election coming up on October 10th, 2007. Let's be frank, he's unwilling to raise taxes because that would be politically damaging for him. And he's unwilling to cut spending because, at least for his constituents, that would be a bad thing. They'd consider it a bad thing, and he might find votes going to something like the NDP. The province of Ontario has no shortage of power to impose new taxes, to raise taxes, etc. So he's needed a way to characterize this demand for federal revenue, a way that doesn't sound so self-serving. And what does he do? He says, well, look, there's this gap, you see. The federal government collects this much money, but of all the money they collect from the Ontario taxpayer, the federal government gives back to the Ontario government only a fraction. This, he says, means that there's a gap between what the federal government collects from Ontarians and what it gives back to Ontario's government to be spent on Ontarians. Well, let's be frank, we pay federal taxes like the federal income tax, the GST. We pay these taxes so that the federal government can do things like pay down the federal debt, can do things like pay for defense, can do things like pay for judges that work in our courts. We don't pay the federal government so that the federal government can then just turn around and give the money to our provincial government. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. That's just a political game. And it's a game that allows provincial politicians to get money without having to pay the political cost of raising taxes. And it's a game that costs us all because it gives the federal government the power to make decisions about what's going on at the provincial level. Now, historically, what has this resulted in? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, federal intrusion into provincial matters has given rise to an unending discontent in Quebec. We all like to think that it's simply a matter of secessionism in Quebec just springing out of nowhere, that all of a sudden Quebec just wanted to go its own way, and started forming separatist parties. That's not the case. Quebec was content in confederation for many decades. But when the federal government started calling the shots at the provincial level, provincial politicians, especially in Quebec, and especially in the West, said, hold on there. This isn't your bailiwick. You're not supposed to be telling us what to teach in our schools, or who to hire in our schools, or what schools to have. You're not supposed to be telling us how to run our healthcare system. You're not supposed to be telling us how to run our welfare system. And that federal intrusion into provincial areas of decision-making, that holding of the gold over the heads of all of the provinces, collecting too much money from provincial taxpayers, and then giving it back to the provincial governments on certain conditions, that is what stoked the fires of secessionism in Quebec. And that is also what's stoking the fires of secessionism in the West. And that's why parties like the Reform Party, for example, came along. The Reform Party came along and said, look, we're going to put an end to this process where the federal government collects more money than it needs and then hands it back to provincial governments on certain conditions. I mean, if you start telling people, we're going to take more money than we need and we're going to give it to other provinces, or we're going to tell you how you have to make your healthcare system or your welfare system or your education system, eventually you say, you know what, we don't need you, federal government. And that's what gives rise to parties like the Bloc, to parties like the Reform Party, regional parties primarily, that wanted to put an end to federal intrusion into provincial areas of decision-making. McGuinty's call for a greater infusion of federal revenues into provincial coffers comes with a price, and that price is that the federal government takes over decision-making in terms of healthcare, education, and welfare. It's a serious mistake, and it's one that has caused Confederation, caused the unity of Canada, much grief over the decades. And why are we doing this? Why are we threatening Canadian unity? Why are we saying to the federal government at the provincial level, why are we saying, get more involved at the provincial level, make us more dependent on you, collect more tax revenue for our purposes, intrude more into Quebec affairs, intrude more into Alberta affairs? Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing it because some politician at the provincial level doesn't have the guts to be frank with his electorate and say, look, we can't afford this, we're going to have to decrease that, or, I'm sorry, but if we're going to maintain these things, we have to increase taxes. Electoral politics, political cowardice at the provincial level is why we have federal intrusion into provincial programs, and it accounts in no small measure for the unrest that leads to secessionist sentiments in Quebec or in the West. This is serious stuff, and I don't think McGuinty has thought this through, and I don't think any of those other politicians in the Ontario legislature who are saying, well, McGuinty's right, we need more federal revenue to be kicked into the provincial coffers. That includes Howard Hampton, and that includes John Tory. It's not how you get more federal revenue kicked into the provincial pot. It's whether you should even ask for it, or whether, in fact, you should demand that the federal government lower taxes, stop collecting more money than it needs to pay for its federal responsibilities. I think the government of Ontario is far too involved in our economy as it is. I think they're spending money on things that ought not to be government expenditures at all. But if a socialist wants to have a great number of programs operated solely by the provincial government, then at least they should have the courage to take full responsibility for imposing the taxes that have to be imposed to pay for those programs. Not doing so threatens Canadian unity. Not doing so renders the Ontario government a mere puppet of the federal government. Not doing so confuses the electorate as to who's responsible for what. I mean, a great number of the public think that the federal government is responsible for health care. That's not the case. The Constitution says it's an exclusively provincial matter. But because the federal government gives money to the provinces and calls it money for health care, people think that the federal government is in charge of health care. And when the healthcare system is failing, who do they blame? Well, they're not quite sure. They can blame the provincial government, or they might blame the federal government. It creates confusion, and that's not fair to the voter, because the blame for our healthcare system lies solely with the province. It's not a federal responsibility. There's a lot of talk right now, both at the provincial level and the federal level, about how we should rework, the equalization program, the process where the federal government collects money from the provincial taxpayer and pays it back over to the provincial governments. There's a lot of talk about that being reworked. And there's a simple way to rework it. Read the Constitution. In the Constitution, there's a part of the Constitution called the Constitution Act 1907. It's the only part of the Constitution that says how much money the federal government is supposed to give to each province. It says how much money is to be given to each province. And if they want to change that amount, if they want to give more money to the province than the Constitution currently allows, the appropriate way to do that is to amend the Constitution. If the federal government were to decide today to comply with the Constitution Act 1907, and if as a result the provincial governments ended up with less money being kicked in from the federal level, that would actually be progress. Because at that point, each premier, each government in each province would have to fess up and admit that they are responsible for their own budgets. That if they have a shortage of money, that it's their responsibility to impose higher taxes or new taxes. That if they're spending too wildly, it's their responsibility to cut spending. The blame game has to stop. If it's healthcare, education, or welfare, the only person to blame is the premier and his cabinet and his majority government. It's not the federal government. There's only one taxpayer. And if too much money is being taxed out of your hands by the federal government, that limits the amount of money that the province has available to it. The province can't impose taxes as high as it would like to impose because there's only one taxpayer and you can't get blood out of a stone. If the Ontario government is to do what's right in this discussion about, rejigging the system, about federal involvement in things like healthcare, education, and welfare, about federal payments to the provincial coffers, then what ought to be done is for the premier to go to Ottawa and say, we want you to simply comply with the Constitution as it's written. Stop taxing people too much. Stop taxing people more than is enough to pay for federal responsibilities. And if at the provincial level we need more money, it'll be the premier's or the provincial government's responsibility either to cut spending or to impose new taxes. No longer will we play the game of blaming one another. It's only fair to the public that we know that whoever's spending the money is the government that should be raising the money. The blame game has to stop. And this notion that there's a gap between how much the federal government collects and how much it pays back to the province is meant for nothing other than to confuse the voter further. There's no gap